Okay.
Oh, just to say, right, so... housekeeping. Oh, there's housekeeping. Your 5-minute sign.
Yeah.
Your running order.
Cool.
Poster. Okay. Running order, housekeeping, and just the schedule.
Yeah.
I've also included here this time.
Let's do it. I take that with me. Read it.
Yeah. Okay. Right. I'm good to go. And some water if anybody needs it.
Cool.
See you in the break.
Fantastic. Okay, let's get started then. Thank you so much for coming today to our, oopsie, I'm already having feedback, to our annual AI UK meeting, which is our large event. So some of you come to our bi-monthly meeting, which is much smaller. And so if you don't know me, I'm Michael Hornberger. I'm the Professor of Applied Dementia Research here at UEA. And we're organizing this regular series to inform you about what's happening out there in the world of dementia research. The smaller meetings which we have, which we show at the end, and you can also find out about when the next one is happening, are usually to showcase what we're doing locally. And if you want to get involved in local studies or find out what we're doing in terms of local dementia research. But this annual meeting is really to showcase what people are doing out there. And we're very often getting more national speakers to showcase what people are working on in different parts of the country. So today we're having an order where we're talking first by Robin Brisbane from Alzheimer's Research UK, who are very kindly sponsoring this event, and he's telling us about what Alzheimer's Research UK is doing. Then we're having, actually the order will be reversed, we're having Ian Coyle-Gilchrist, who's just moved last year up from Cambridge to be now a new consultant of dementia here at the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital, and he talks about the research he's done already in Cambridge, and which hopefully he will expand here further. And then finally we have Parish Malhotra from Imperial College London, and so we're delighted to have them all here. And just to say in terms of schedule, we'll have a short break at 2:55 where there will be some tea and coffee and you have a bit of a break, which will be after Robin and Ian's talk. Just to say, fire alarms, no planned fire alarms for today, so if the fire alarm sounds, please make your way via the fire exits, which I think are 2 here on the front but also at the back. And if you just make your way outside in front of the center, basically. And the bathrooms are out there and at the end of the corridors. Right, finally we have some feedback forms. These feedback forms are really important for us. Every year we collect them to know what's working, what's maybe not working so well, and also if you have any topic suggestions. Okay? Finally, if you're sitting right at the back, this room, we know that the acoustics can be sometimes tricky in the back. If you have any problems, please feel free to move forward, and then you might be able to hear much better. But without further ado, I hand over to Robin, who's going to talk to us about the work of Alzheimer's Research UK. Over to you, Robin.
Thank you very much, Michael. Okay, hello everyone. As Michael said, my name's Robin. I'm the Science Communications Manager at Alzheimer's Research UK. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of an intro to the work that we do at AI UK. So is this feedback intolerable, or is it okay? Is that better? Yeah. Okay. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the work we do at AI UK, go over some of the basics about dementia. So I know a lot of you come to these bi-monthly meetings that I've been hearing about. So sorry if some of this is going over some well-trodden ground for you, but I hope you won't mind me doing that for the benefit of other people in the room. Yes, so Alzheimer's Research UK is the UK's leading charity that focuses on biomedical research into dementia. So this means that the donations we receive from our supporters go towards trying to find out more about the diseases that cause dementia, and then finding new ways to prevent, treat, and diagnose the condition. So imagine many of you who have come along to this meeting today have felt the impact of dementia in some way in your personal lives. So just to go over how it affects society, we think that 850,000 people in the UK are living with dementia. This is as many as 50 million internationally. We did some surveys last year, some national field work to try and find out what proportion of the population knows someone who's living with dementia, and it seems to us that 1 in 2 people have a close friend or family member who has had the condition. And as well as the individual impact and the impact dementia has on families, there's also a very big financial impact. So dementia and the cost associated with caring for people with dementia impacts the economy to the tune of £26 billion a year, which is more than cancer and heart disease combined. But despite this enormous personal and financial impact, around 6 times more is spent on cancer research than it is on dementia research. And obviously, cancer research is extremely important, but we want to sort of get to a parity with dementia research funding, considering the impact that the condition has. So what is dementia? So most people will think of dementia as some sort of memory loss, but it's a word we give to a group of symptoms that can include memory loss, but it also includes things like personality changes, communication difficulties, reasoning problems, and these symptoms get worse over time and affect the way that people can go about their day-to-day lives. And dementia is caused by diseases, and these are the names of the most common diseases that cause dementia. Alzheimer's disease there is the most common, accounting for about 2/3 of dementia cases. So Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia, but there are other forms like vascular dementia, which is to do with the blood vessels in the brain not supplying blood in the way that it normally does. Alzheimer's and vascular dementia can often occur together, and then people are diagnosed with mixed dementia. There's also dementia with Lewy bodies. It affects about 100,000 people in the UK. Some of the symptoms are closely associated with Parkinson's disease. Frontotemporal dementia, which tends to affect younger people, causing communication problems and behavioural changes. Parkinson's disease can lead to dementia, and then there are also rarer forms as well. So what all these diseases have in common, even though there's different chemical processes underway in the brain, is that they all damage nerve cells in the brain and the connection between nerve cells in the brain. So during the course of these diseases, more and more nerve cells become damaged, and the brain actually starts to physically shrink. And these changes that occur in the brain can happen maybe 20 years before symptoms start to show. In Alzheimer's disease, we know that the damage is associated with these two proteins, amyloid and tau, but each of the diseases has different characteristics. So these processes can get underway maybe 20 years before symptoms start to show, but at the moment people can only be really be diagnosed when they start to display these symptoms. And the symptoms can overlap between one form of dementia and another, so it's very difficult for doctors to give people a definitive diagnosis of the disease that's causing their symptoms. So one of the things we want to do is improve the accuracy and the timeliness of diagnosis. We also know there are lifestyle factors that can affect our risk of dementia. So maybe 30% of dementia cases might be attributable to lifestyle and other health factors, whereas 60 to 80% might be down to our genetic makeup. But these are the things that a doctor would recommend in order to keep our risk of dementia as low as possible. And what you'll notice is that many of these things are similar to what a doctor would tell you to do to reduce your risk of heart disease. So in general terms, what's good for your heart also tends to be good for your head. Now, of course, what we're really after is new treatments for dementia. Now, there are some treatments that might be prescribed to people with Alzheimer's disease and dementia with Lewy bodies to treat some of the symptoms. And what these treatments do is boost the levels of a chemical messenger in the brain so that nerve cells in the brain can communicate better with one another. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't stop the damage from occurring. It just helps to compensate for some of that damage for a certain period of time, maybe about a year, 18 months. These treatments don't work for everyone, but they have important benefits to many people. A key thing that we want to do is to develop treatments that are disease modifying, that will help protect nerve cells from the damaging processes. So overall, we want to understand diseases like Alzheimer's better, find more effective ways that we can all reduce our risk of dementia. We want to be able to diagnose people earlier and more accurately, and of course, we want to develop new treatments. So ARUK's work spans the whole process from scientific ideas that people have in the lab. We follow those through with careful analysis. We have drug discovery institutes that are working to develop new drugs that could potentially tackle these disease processes. We follow that research up in people, looking at things like brain scans. We want to get new drugs into clinical trials involving people, and then eventually treatments in the hands of patients. So we do this by funding research right around the UK and increasingly internationally. We've got these 15 regional network centres where we encourage scientists to work together. We provide funding for them to generate preliminary data, to kickstart new research studies, and also to put on events like this to try and raise awareness of dementia. Now, I work in the communications team at ARUK, and one of the things that we do is to try and ensure that dementia research is covered responsibly in the press. And yeah, I think we've still got some work to do, still got some way to go. But whenever these stories come out, we try and provide a comment that puts the research into some sort of context and tries to analyse what the study might be really telling us, rather than sometimes the slightly sensational headlines that we see most weeks. We've got a range of other resources on our website, alzheimersresearchuk.org. We have a blog, we have information about different forms of dementia, and all the latest dementia research news. We also have this service called the Dementia Research Info Line. So this is a sort of help desk service that you can call and put your questions to our information officers. If you've seen something about dementia research and you want to know more, you can give them a call or you can email them, and they'll be very happy to answer your questions. The team also produced these information leaflets. We've brought a selection along here today. If you would like more of these for your workplace or anything like that, then please come and talk to us and we can ship these out for free to you. And our help desk also supports this service called Join Dementia Research, which is a sort of research register, so you can sign up to let people know that you're interested in taking part in dementia research studies. So a lot of the research that we fund really relies on volunteers who take part. So if you're interested in Join Dementia Research, taking part in studies, then please either Google Join Dementia Research or contact our Dementia Research Info Line. Finally, as well as our research work and our communications work, We also have an important policy and public affairs function, so trying to make sure that dementia stays at the top of the political agenda so we can get more government funding for research. And we've had this campaign called Just 1%, where we're trying to get the government to invest 1% of the final financial impact of dementia into dementia research. Okay, and finally, none of the work that we do would be possible without our supporters, who are incredibly generous and dedicated to finding new ways to help people with dementia. They do all sorts of incredible things to raise money for us. We were partners in the London Marathon this year. Over 2,000 runners were running for our Dementia Revolution campaign. Okay, now I'm going to pass you over to Ian. Thank you very much. There might be an opportunity for questions at the end, but thank you.
Excellent. Well, I'm not Ian, but I'm just introducing Ian. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce Ian Coyle-Gilchrist, who I said I know for actually several years already, and it's our time in Cambridge. So it's a great pleasure to have you here now with us at the hospital and to hear about your research in apathy in dementia. Over to you.
Okay. Just mention one thing.
Yes.
Are you going to be walking about? If you are, it's okay to wear the lapel mic. If you're going to stay at the lectern, then best turn it off because otherwise it's feedbacking.
Shall I stay at the lectern? I think it's probably easier.
Yes,
Yeah.
but you have to turn the lapel mic on.
And the lapel is off.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you.
Brilliant. Hello. I'm one of the consultant neurologists at the Norfolk and Norwich. Before that, I was a registrar and a research fellow in Cambridge. I'm going to talk to you about apathy in dementia and why I think it's important. Well, here is why I think it's important, because it's common. Probably about half of people with Alzheimer's have apathy at any one time, 90% over the course of their illness. It's disabling, so when we see apathy, we know it's associated with higher levels of disability. It's distressing, and that's not just for the person with dementia, but for the people around them. And apathy very strongly correlates with carer distress. And partly for that reason, but not only, it's also associated with higher care costs. It's a risk for going into institutionalised care, and probably a worse prognosis overall as well. And so for all of those reasons, I think it's a very attractive target for treatment. And there have been a range of different things and trials looking to treat apathy with drugs and with other things. And the results of those have been rather contradictory and overall a little bit disappointing. And I'd like to talk to you about why I think that is and what I think we can do to get around it. I'm going to show you some data. It's going to be mostly from the PIPIN study, which came out of Cambridge but was in collaboration with Norfolk and the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital as well. PIPIN stands for Pick's Disease and Progressive Supranuclear Palsy Prevalence and Incidence Study, which probably tells you more about the sorts of people who named these than the study itself. This was a large study, and it was looking at people who have something called frontotemporal lobar degeneration. Now, that's another one of these umbrella terms. It encompasses frontotemporal dementia, which is one of the commonest forms of dementia before retirement age and gets even more common as we get older, and then progressive supranuclear palsy and corticobasal degeneration. And these are all characterized by progressive changes in language, in behavior and in movement. And that's in association with shrinkage of the frontal lobes, you can see lit up there, and the temporal lobes in the brain, which are those bits there. And the reason that we use these disorders to study apathy is because in these, apathy is particularly severe, very common, and occurs very early on. So we have the opportunity to study apathy in a relatively pure form. Now, Alzheimer's, dementia with Lewy body, they also affect the frontal and the temporal lobes, but at a later stage. And in FTLD, we have the opportunity to look at apathy early in the illness. So, how do you treat apathy? And this is the way that most trials and studies have gone so far. You measure it, then you treat it with your drug or whatever it may be. And then you measure it again and see whether it's had a benefit or not. So how do you measure apathy? And, well, the obvious answer is you ask somebody, how do you feel? And so this is an example of doing that. This is somebody I met who had frontotemporal dementia. And what we did was we asked her, can you mark on the line, on the scale going from not at all the way through to extremely, how interested are you right now? And what she's done, she's drawn a box around the word extremely. And so we said, well, that's not quite what we meant. If you could mark on the scale, put a mark on it to show us how excited you are now. And she's, like a school teacher, she's marked it with a tick. And I said, well, thanks, but no. If you put a line through the scale to show me. And so she's put a line through the word extremely. And we've tried again with tired, and she's gone back to not at all. And then we've tried again with stimulated, and this time she's marked the word extremely. And then finally we've tried with bored, and she tried marking and said, no, not quite. Put a line through, not at all. No, that's, again, put a line through to show me how you're feeling right now. And she's put 2 lines through the word extremely to say that's definitely not that. And this is a lady who's early on in her illness. She's still managing her own finances. She's not driving, but she booked the taxi to come and see me, paid for it herself, independent living. And this is not severe dementia in the normal concept, but she has great difficulty with understanding and completing this task in a way that you wouldn't necessarily anticipate. So what I'm trying to get across is if we are asking people with brain diseases to report how they're feeling, we have to understand that they will respond in ways that we're not necessarily anticipating and can be quite difficult to predict. So there's an alternative approach, which is ask somebody else. And so this is something that we've done. This is some data looking at about 100 people with FTLD. And we've asked them to complete something called the apathy evaluation scale. And that's a questionnaire which asks you about particular symptoms that relate to apathy. And our patients with FTLD, that's the red column, they report high levels of symptoms, more so than healthy people of a similar sort of age. That's the blue column. So they are reporting apathetic symptoms. You can ask the same set of questions, but ask for a carer, somebody who knows them well, normally a spouse. And they report the same set of symptoms. They're reporting increased levels of apathy, and that's fine. And there's a third version of this, which is something I complete, which is combining what the person with dementia is telling me along with my observations of what they're saying. And all 3 charts look similar. In each case, we're seeing higher levels of apathy compared with healthy controls. If you then do some statistics on this, you'll see there's good, positive, significant correlations between what the patient is saying and what I'm recording on my assessment. There's good, easy, significant correlations between what I'm recording and what the carers, their spouses, are saying. But these don't correlate with each other. And so what that's saying is that the patient is reporting apathy and apathetic symptoms. Their spouse or their carer is reporting apathy and apathetic symptoms, but they're not reporting the same symptoms at the same time. And what I'm trying to get across here is that when you're assessing something like apathy, assessors disagree and don't necessarily report as we're expecting. Now, there are lots of reasons for that. One of the things that's often suggested is that the person with dementia lacks insight or has problems identifying their emotional state. Now, that might be true, but also we're seeing that the people with dementia are reporting apathy and apathetic symptoms. So it can't be the whole answer. And similarly, people say that other people might be making the wrong assumptions. You can see there's a little cartoon saying it's not apathy, it's Botox. Lack of facial expression we see in dementia. It doesn't necessarily mean you're not feeling underneath it. And I think the other thing that this is telling us is that the ways that we normally measure things like apathy are not necessarily objective. And also these tools, which were devised and designed using healthy, apparently normal American students, and then being converted for use in psychiatry, how we apply that in brain diseases is not necessarily as clear as we might have thought. The other thing I wanted to point out is going back to my example patient, is if you look, what she has done is she's gone for the extremes on each emotion. It's either extremely or not at all. There's no consideration of the middle ground. And the next thing I did after we'd completed this was I said, well, look, can you draw me what a bored face looks like, or what a tired face, sad, angry? And how about somebody who's interested, happy, or excited? Now, I would suggest to you that apart from the hairstyles, the sad faces don't look very different, and the happy faces don't look very different. What I think has happened is that she has lost the subtleties in between these emotions, and it's become very much all or nothing. And if that's the case, that's very important when we study emotional states and motivational states like apathy. Now, that's not research, that's an example, but we have done research on these sorts of things. These are people with progressive supranuclear palsy, and they have great difficulty recognizing facial expressions and emotion in the face of other people. So the people with PSP are the black lines there, and you can see they're getting less facial recognition right compared with healthy controls. And that's been done in a range of different forms of dementia. What we know in PSP is that that does relate to structural changes within the brain, and it relates to areas within the frontal lobes. Now, so far, you might have noticed I've dodged trying to define what apathy is. And of course, we all have an idea that loss of spark, less motivation, less get up and go is actually quite a difficult thing to define. I would suggest that a good definition is it's a reduction in goal-directed thinking, goal-directed cognition. And if you think about what I mean by that, well, that's the idea of having an idea and then planning it out, being motivated to do it, weighing up the pros and cons, then actually how you're going to do it, then doing it, and then evaluating the outcome. It's more than one thing. And so it's not surprising that more than one area of the brain can lead to apathy. And here is an even worse slide. And please don't try and read all of this, but this is a reminder for me to say that we know from people who've had strokes, we know from animal models, we know from functional brain imaging, that damage and changes within different areas of the brain can affect different things that lead to apathy. So in the blue, there's changes in the way that we process emotions, changes in the way that we're able to plan, changes in autoactivation that's generating the idea in the first place can all lead to decreased goal-directed cognition. But then on the other side, which hasn't quite come across in the slide perfectly, on red, is saying that also other areas of the brain that are involved in language, in movement, in emotional distress, they can make it harder to do things. And so you need more motivation to do it. And they can reduce the amount of motivation you have. Now, that's not a reduction in goal-directed cognition. That's not apathy as I would think about it. But it can lead to the same symptoms. And then if we're relying on you to tell us about the symptoms, we also have to accept that that comes with your own ideas, impressions, and your own emotional state. And all of those can feed in and affect the reported symptoms. So, if we want to try and test our treatments, if we want to look and understand what's going on in the brain in more detail, we need to identify these problematic symptoms, apathetic behavior, but we need then to find objective ways of measuring the underlying cognitive processes that are going on. And there are a range of different ways that we do this. Here is one example, which is a phenomenally boring test where you sit in front of a computer with arrows pointing left and right and left and right, and you press a button left and right as quick as you can until you hear a beep that tells you to stop. And what we can do is vary the time between seeing the arrow and hearing the beep. And by doing that, we can get a measure of how well you're able to inhibit an action. So it's part of the processing that we use in our goal-directed behavior. And that's one example, and there are a range of other computerized and automated tests we can use to measure aspects of decision-making, of goal-directed cognition behavior. And if we do that, these are some graphs showing you from the Pippin study, patients and healthy controls, and we see that they perform differently on these tests across a range of different measures. And that's reassuring. We'd expect to see that. It's more difficult to explain this, which is then when we take this patient group who are performing differently and we split them up and say, well, if your carers are telling us you're apathetic or you're not, is there a difference on these tests? And at a sort of group level, the answer is no. There aren't significant differences. Now, that's not a fault with the methods. It doesn't mean that these tests aren't working, and nor does it mean what the carers are telling us is wrong, but it's telling us that each measure in isolation isn't enough to capture and encompass the entire thing. And that's exactly what you'd expect, based on what I've told you so far, in that decision-making in goal-directed cognition is more than one thing. We're expecting multiple things to get disrupted at the same time. And so one isolated measure isn't going to capture the whole thing. What I would suggest that means is that as opposed to just relying on subjective reports, on interviews, on questionnaires, and instead of just relying on individual points of goal-directed cognition of behaviour, we need to use both together. And we need to have a multifaceted and a multimodal way of assessing and measuring apathy. And that's something that we've done. You can combine these multi-measures together, and then you can apply statistical models on it and use the outcomes of that to find common themes that underpin apathy. And then we can relate that across to, well, biomarkers, brain imaging. So that's me without a beard and without hair. And I can slice me up and look in my brain, and we can do that with people who've gone through these measures as well. And this is work by Claire Lansdell a couple of years ago. And she did exactly that. Large group of people with frontotemporal lobe degeneration, a whole range of different ways of measuring apathy, and then putting it into a statistical model, finding the common themes that underlie that, and then looking at how they relate to the brain. And what she found is there are distinct areas of the brain that each relate to distinct areas of apathy. And for the first time, she's able to unpick those and identify them. That's very powerful in itself, but it shows us more than that, because she's then gone on and said, well, what does that mean? What does that mean for the patients? And she's shown, as I told you in my first slide, apathy has prognostic implications, but not all apathy is the same. And so some of these underlying core factors strongly predict a worse prognosis, others do not. And so now we have a much more focused and targeted way of looking and understanding how apathy is working. So in my last few slides, I thought I'd talk about treatment and treatment of apathy as we understand it at the moment. Now, I would suggest to you all that it's not one size fits all. And when people come to me and say, well, my husband or I am apathetic, what I want to know is, what do you mean? I well remember the time they said, well, every time I cook a delicious meal, he only eats half of it. And what was actually happening was he couldn't see half the plate, and if you turn it round, he eats the other half. It's important to work out what they mean when they say apathy. Why does somebody appear to be apathetic? What effect does it have? And why is it a problem, and who's it a problem for? If the problem is not the patient feels fine, but the people around them are getting very distressed, the way that you explain and the way that you target your treatment is going to be different. Explanation, I think, is the most useful aspect to this. This is not laziness, it's not your fault. Trying to break tasks down into small, manageable chunks, and also pick your battles. Decide what you need to do and what you want to do, and find the meaningful things that you enjoy. And there is a fine line, but a clear difference between gentle prompting and encouragement and nagging, which doesn't help. And then similarly, if you are looking after somebody with dementia, one of the most effective treatments is to look after yourself and keep yourself well. There is, I think, a limited role for medication. And so some of the drugs that we use in, for example, Alzheimer's disease might be helpful in some forms of apathy. I look very hard for depression, and if I find depression, I treat it, but I don't treat apathy with antidepressants. And the other medication that have been proposed, some of the stimulant medications, for example, they all need further research. I would suggest the way of researching, the way of investigating these other medications is exactly what I've shown you today, which is split apathy, a big, broad, rather subjective term, down into objective, measurable chunks, relate those back to the brain itself, not just to the anatomy, but the underlying chemistry, And in doing that, we then have a target for our treatments and a way of measuring whether they're working. Lots of people have worked on this. And down the left column are the people who have directly worked on the Pippin study itself, and down the right-hand side are a lot of other people who've been enormously helpful along the way, and in particular the bottom right, which is our patients and volunteers. And I think these slides are going online. If people want to read more of the basic science, there are a load of references there. Thank you.
Great, fantastic. Well, we have some time for questions now. So, if you have any questions, we have some roving mics, I think, yeah, at the sides. So if you have, please raise your hand so everybody can hear your question. Do we have any questions? Maybe I kick us off then with one question. One thing I'm always worried about with apathy is that I wonder how people were before they had the disease. Did some people already were not as motivated?
Yes.
If I think about myself taking out the bin or anything like that, I'm less motivated. So how do you take that into account, how motivated?
Yeah, it's very difficult. So in clinical practice, I think it's really important. I well remember somebody coming enormously distressed because her husband was very, very apathetic. She told me all he does is sit in front of the TV every day. And I said, well, how was he before he got ill? And the answer was, well, he just sat in front of the TV all day. And actually the important thing there is not that they're telling the wrong thing, but actually what they're using is apathy as a way of exhibiting their own distress at the situation they found themselves in. And the problem wasn't the apathy itself, the problem was the fact that they're going through a horrendous time. In terms of basic research into apathy, it's difficult. One of the ways you can get around this, of course, is by having, like we have, big numbers of people and having a large group so that you hope those sort of pre-morbid, before the illness, differences are taken out. But also, I suggest that those are not necessarily irrelevant here. And that how we are before we get dementia probably does have an effect on what our dementia is like later on. And that's not something we should completely cancel out, but something which is important. The advantage of this kind of work is that it doesn't come with any preconceived ideas, and we can split things apart, and we can just look for common themes. And when we find that, the key then is having other things, so that's like the biomarkers, like the brain imaging, but also genetics and chemical signatures. And we can use those to try and investigate the results of our statistical analysis. We go in with no assumption, and then we explore what we find at the end.
Yes, over there.
Hi, Ian. Thank you very much for the talk. I'm very interested, as you know, in initiation for activities in daily life. And one of the challenges I find when we're interviewing the family members, it's sometimes when it's not clear whether the person is not starting an activity because they are apathetic, lack motivation, or whether they forgot to start the task. So how would you address, what's your suggestion to trying to untangle this, the neurobasis can be a little bit complex.
Yeah, I think you're right to say that it's complicated and each individual is going to be different and people can appear apathetic for lots of different reasons. In terms of how we address that in the clinic, well, the way is then looking at how things are being introduced, what's happening, how they're trying to do tasks in the first place. And if you say to somebody, right, I'm going out, and when I'm out, could you do this, do this, do this? It's not going to work. On the other hand, if you have small, manageable chunks, individual things, and you've reinforced that with prompts, with written lists, things that are understandable, and you've tested that that works, that's a much better way of approaching it. I think the sort of the auto-activation that we're talking about, that spark to actually start doing things, when we see that, certainly in the clinical syndromes that I spend my time looking at, I think it's really quite marked and really quite dramatic in the forms that I see. So I'm always struck by the fact that people with progressive supranuclear palsy, if I ask them a question, you will hear nothing back for almost an embarrassingly long period of time, just to the point where I'm about to interrupt and ask the question again. And then they answer. And so what that's showing me is that they're having great difficulty in getting the neural activity to stimulate and have that response in the first place. if you spot that, it's really key then to give people time. Even if you feel uncomfortable that moment, wait, it's coming. If you jump in and ask the question again, then you go back to the start, and you can spend the whole day interrupting just before you get the answer.
That was a lovely talk. Thanks for going through it all and so clearly. But I just wanted to ask, so in some dementias, you get variation of symptoms during the day. And has anybody ever looked at whether apathy can vary during the day or motivation changes?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I'm sure the answer is yes, but I'm not immediately aware of a study that I can bring to mind. One of the interesting aspects of that, of course, is that almost all of the studies that look at that sort of thing, if you're making multiple measures of apathy throughout the day, then you're going to have to use a very quick screen. And I've shown you why that's not going to work. And also we have the confounding aspects there of if you're tired, you need more motivation. It's not that you're more apathetic, it's that you need more motivation to do it. So you're going to have changes in rhythms during the day as well.
Right. Don't be shy. Yes, please.
Thank you. You've raised a very interesting point about the difference between the carer's attitude to apathy and the patient's attitude. I'm just wondering how much research in general, not just in terms of apathy, concentrates on the carers as opposed to the patients.
That's a very good question. I think there's nobody here who would say there's been enough research in either aspect of this. And there is research looking at how carers' attitudes and also how they were before dementia came into the relationship affects how symptoms are reported, and there is an influence there. But also there's a degree of research showing that particular symptoms and particular forms of dementia have different effects on carers. And of course, that's to be expected. If people are behaving differently in the relationship, it is going to have a different impact on you. There's some work, but not enough, looking at how if we help with the carers and help work with them to work with the person with dementia, it can have an impact and effect on the levels of apathy that are reported. But all of this research, certainly when we talk about apathy, is compounded and confounded by the problem that the way that we measure apathy is a bit too simplistic, and this is a much more complicated subject than we appreciated before.
Yeah, I think this is the big challenge, isn't it? Because you measure somewhat an absence of something, not that there's something additional there.
Yeah, it's very difficult to measure something that somebody's not doing.
Measure an absence, exactly.
And try recruiting for a study on apathy. It's a real challenge.
Yeah, the people who don't come forward are very Any other questions we're having for Ian? Yes, please, over there.
You said if you're working with someone and you think there might be depression, you would treat the depression rather than treat the apathy with antidepressants. What features are you looking for specifically that would make you think depression rather than apathy?
So I suppose I wouldn't be thinking depression rather than apathy, but I know depression and apathy go hand in hand. When I think about depression, certainly in terms of depression in dementia, I'm looking for active negative emotional states. I'm not looking for the absence of emotion. I'm looking for people who feel bad. And sometimes, certainly in the frontotemporal dementias, and that's the lady who's having great difficulty completing my little scales, abstract terms and sort of really trying to understand and explore their emotions in the way that we're all trained to do with big open questions doesn't work so well. And I tend to take quite a blunt approach and say, how are you feeling? Do you feel sad? And the people who feel sad will tell you. And that is an indicator that there may be depression going on. Somebody who doesn't feel sad, who also doesn't feel happy, isn't necessarily depressed. And we know that those people, antidepressants are less likely to be helpful. We know that if you treat apathy in isolation with antidepressants. There's no good evidence that that works, and there's some bad evidence that it might be actively harmful in terms of making the apathy worse. But we also know, even in dementia, if you have active negative emotional states and depression, antidepressants can still be effective.
Right, so if we don't have any further questions, we're having now a short break, and I think Ian needs to leave pretty soon, but if you've been shy in the big audience, you might come down to talk to him or talk a brief over coffee. But if you'd be back by 3:20 actually, let's make it a bit shorter, then we're having more time for later. So if you find yourself outside for coffee and tea, and we just thank Ian final time for his talk. Thank you very much.